Good evening. I declare this meeting of the Planning Committee for Port Phillip City Council open, and I welcome the members of the public that are here tonight. The City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Yalukit Willem clan of the Boomerang. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and we acknowledge and uphold their traditional relationship to this land. Council has a local law that determines how this meeting will be conducted. And there's a time allotted in tonight's agenda for public question time. There's also an opportunity for members of the public to ask a question or make a comment on a specific item on tonight's agenda, and this will be done prior to the committee considering the item. If you wish to ask a question or speak to a report, please complete the blue form that's available at the table just outside the chamber and hand it to a staff member. If you have already registered online, please ensure a staff member knows that you're present. And I encourage you to limit your questions and comments to 3 minutes tonight, as we've got a lot of people, and to try and avoid repeating any points that have previously been made by other speakers. This committee can only address questions and deals with items within its delegation, and that is planning matters. All planning committee meetings are live streamed to allow the community to watch and to listen in real time. So welcome to everyone that's watching online. And please note that under Council's local law, this meeting cannot be filmed or audio taped unless permission is granted by the Chair. In the unlikely event of an emergency evacuation, please follow the instructions of the emergency warden. Okay, we're going to go to the agenda now, and first up we've got apologies, and tonight we have no councillor apologies. Item 2, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. So councillors, the minutes of the planning meeting held on the 25th of September 2019 have been circulated. Are there any questions relating to these minutes? Thank you. Councillor Baxter has asked to move and Councillor Simic to second. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. We'll move to item 3 on the agenda, which is declarations of conflicts of interest. Does any councillor have a conflict in tonight's agenda? Councillor Baxter.
Yes, Madam Chair. I, Councillor Tim Baxter, declare that in items 4.1 and 7.1, I have an indirect interest by way of conflicting duties due to a relationship with an objector, and will have to leave the chamber in those items.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. So just to be clear, that's anything to do with Tiuna Grove. Okay, then we move to item 4, which is petitions and joint letters. And so prior to public question time, pursuant to Council's meeting procedure local law, the CEO has requested and the Mayor has given consent to the adding of a petition to tonight's agenda. So councillors, we've got one petition for consideration. Councillor Baxter?
I'll declare my conflict of interest and leave the chamber.
We'll see you soon. Okay. How many people have we got to speak? Okay, councillors, we've received one request to speak on this agenda item. So I'd now like to call Elvis de Jong to the table, and the petition is item 4.1, which is titled Stop Destruction of Elwood's Heritage Buildings. If you would please, Mr de Jong, state your name and suburb for the records. Please turn it on.
Okay. Yes, my name's Elvis de Jong. I'm from Elwood, at 6 Bendigo Avenue.
Thank you. If you could speak.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor, councillors. Oh, sorry. Is that better? Oh, thank you. Thanks, Mayor, councillors. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for what you did in June to protect 3 and 5 Tiuna Grove. I am here today, though, to ask that you stand firm on that commitment that you made back then and reject the new proposal from the developer. Tonight I present to you another petition. We started this just 2 weeks ago, specifically addressing the issues of the new proposal. We ran it for just under a week and then shut it down to meet council rules so that we could present it to you tonight. In that time, less than 7 days, we had 458 signatures. Now, 458 signatures that do not want this proposal to go ahead. So I think that that amount of signatures in such a short space of time should amply convey to you the discontent of the community over this proposal. As you will be aware, the new proposal is that just the facades and the front rooms of the heritage properties are retained, with a very large apartment complex wrapping around from number 1 along the rear boundary of the 3 properties to a length in excess of 50 metres. This proposal substantially does not meet the requirements of the heritage protection that was afforded it by you and by the Minister of Planning just 4 short months ago. Some of its many failures include that there is a 200% increase in dwellings in a heritage zone, which should essentially have a 0 increase in dwellings. It should have no growth in the heritage zone. It reduces the lot sizes of the 2 heritage properties by 1/3 in contravention of the policy that asks that the original subdivision patterns of a heritage place be maintained. It also does not respect the scale. The building at number 1 does not respect the size and scale of the heritage properties as required. This is also exemplified by the report by Ray Tonkin that I think you've had opportunity to read. In the end, though, the real question for council is if it's the intent of the heritage policy, if it's the intent of the planning scheme that just the front shell of heritage properties be retained, abutting massed apartment complexes on the rear. Is that the vision that we have for the heritage zones in the city of Port Phillip? Is that what we're going to see? Because that is not the vision that we currently have in our policy statement.
Please come to the end, Mr. De Jong.
Sorry, if I may just finish. It's the current vision is that we have garden settings with rear and side setbacks. This proposal does not meet that. So we all ask that the council reject this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. De Jong, you were speaking to the petition. Councillors, do you have any questions in relation to the petition? Councillor Simic?
Just in relation to the officer's recommendation at point 2, to advise the petitioner that this matter is scheduled to be considered by VCAT at a 7-day hearing commencing on 2nd of December 2019. The second part of that says, and further advises the process for members of the public to be heard at the VCAT hearing. Just wondering, that second part of the sentence, is that only specific to the petitioner? What exactly does that mean?
Mr. Borg? I'm not sure that you... The second part of the question of the officer's recommendation and further advises the process for members of the public. What does that mean?
Through you, Madam Chair, that really we're just going to leave ourselves open for a discussion with the objectives if they want to talk about how the process will play out when it gets to VCAT.
So will a formal meeting be held, or will all objectors be notified in some way? What's suggested to happen by the officers?
What was intended that will write to the lead petitioner and offer an opportunity if they wish to meet again and have a discussion. We also have met with a number of residents previously, so very happy to continue those discussions.
Any further questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover? Councillor Simic to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond to second. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Simic?
Just to thank the petitioner for speaking tonight and for bringing this petition to us and everyone who's contributed to it. It is really important that council is open to the community and listening to the community in every instance and listening to the different points of view. This is one way to speak to councillors, and I appreciate it that people have taken the time to participate in the petition. And I thank the officers for leaving themselves open to continue the conversation and to continue to provide the opportunity to respond to people if there's further questions regarding council's role in this matter.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Councillor Bond, would any other councillor like to speak? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Now, we'll move on to the reports on the agenda. And councillors, I'm going to change the agenda since we have some speakers to some other items and we have a lot of speakers to Tiuna Grove. I'm actually going to hear 7.2 first, 7.3 and 7.4 and then go to Tiuna. So we'll move to 7.2, 101 Victoria Avenue, Albert Park. We've got two speakers. Mr. Mike, yep. You're right, Councillor Bond, thank you. Public question time. And we have no members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Okay, then we'll go to 7.2. 101 Victoria Avenue, Albert Park. We'll go to the objector first. Ms. Catherine Thompson, please.
I think that's on.
Please state your name and suburb.
My name is Catherine Thompson. I'm the householder and ratepayer at 2 Dinsdale Street, Albert Park, and I'm one of 31 objectors in this matter. So I'd like to thank Phillip Beard for accurately representing our objections and not, of course, for the recommendation to proceed notwithstanding. I think my points that I want to raise are fairly general. That there is a planning void for Gatehouse Lane. So all the report concerns the front facade, which is supported by heritage overlay onto Victoria Avenue, but nothing to Gatehouse Lane. Most of the premises at Victoria Avenue also have separate residential dwellings at the rear at Gatehouse Lane, and they have their own residential addresses. However, for this side of the road, even though it is residential, there are literally no planning constraints, and the only constraints are imposed by the sightline to Victoria Avenue, to which this is non-compliant, being 27 degrees, not 10. The residential community is affected by each one of these applications, and each application then creates a precedent for the next one. So we think that we would like to see an understanding that the rear of a commercial community then becomes a residential community when you have residential addresses on it, and it should be treated exactly the same way as the other parts of the adjacent residential precinct, which is 9.5 metres away on the other side of the narrow laneway. The other point that I would like to make is that there's a pattern of behaviour which, from listening to the earlier objections, is not unique. And this is the residential, so you'll see that Jenny's front wall is the one on the rear. That's Jenny there. The white roller door is 101, and there's also a planning application for the roller door on the left to 105, and that is tiered back. All the other properties, as you can see, are tiered back. This is not tiered back. on my properties on the other side of the road. So I think there's pattern of behaviour, which is that a developer will put in something which is an aggressive application, but on the verge of being okay, it's then passed, and they then spend a large amount of time and money putting in additional applications which further, which increase the bulk and scale of the development, either through pushing back the sightline, through increasing another storey, or through deleting parking, all of which this developer has been doing. Now, it's my view that they'll keep carrying on until they get something more aggressive than the original, and I wonder whether it would be possible at some point simply to reset and make them start again. Just a thought. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms Thompson. Now I'd call on the applicant, Michael Meyer.
Thank you, councillors. I'm here on behalf of the permit applicant in relation to this proposal. I think the first thing to clarify for you is this is an application to amend a planning permit. There's an existing approval on the site for a 3-storey building in behind the existing shopfront, and the existing presentation to Gatehouse Lane in the amended proposal remains relatively unchanged from that which has already been approved by this council. The reason we're seeking an amendment to this permit was our client, who's seeking to occupy this site with his business and his residents, obtained an original permit that contained a basement. Now, the conditions of the site meant that a basement on a narrow site like this, in those soil conditions, wasn't possible, so we needed to explore other options. That brought us to council with a 4-storey proposal, which drew quite a lot of community interest, and following a consultation meeting with councillors and residents of the community, the plans were amended back to the 3-storey scheme, which is currently before you tonight. That 3-storey scheme before you is, as I mentioned, to the rear interface, is relatively similar to that which has been previously approved, with the primary changes being in relation to the provision of car parking on the site, as well as the setback of their first and second floor from Victoria Avenue. We note that the first and second floor setbacks have been developed and referred to Council's Heritage Advisor, which is supportive of the revised setbacks to Victoria Avenue at those levels. And we've also gone through the exercise of ensuring that the car parking reduction that was granted in the previous approval is comparable to that which is contained within the approval before you tonight. So it's our submission that to you and our request that Council Officer's recommendation be supported and a notice of decision to grant a permit be issued. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Meyer. That's all the speakers to this item. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand?
Could I ask the officers just to comment on Ms Thompson's comments about the treatment of the impacts at the rear of the building along Gatehouse Lane, in terms of what we're actually deciding tonight, in terms of the visual bulk, in terms of increased traffic, in terms of any other amenity, change of amenity that our decision tonight would actually affect.
Thank you, Mr Beard.
Through you, Madam Chair, as the applicants pointed out, from a bulk point of view, within any reasonable measure of statistical tolerance, the two plans, the approved plan and the revised 3-storey plan, would essentially be identical. So height, mass, shadow, sunlight impacts, those sorts of traditional amenity impacts would be virtually identical between the two plans. Traffic flow would probably be slightly less, probably imperceptibly, but given the reduction in car parking provision, there would be fewer cars coming and going at the back of the site. There are some slight changes in materiality, but nothing of amenity impact. So the view is that shrinking the building or reducing the building from 4 to 3 at the back would result in a situation that would be very, very much akin to the current approval.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation for a Section 72 application to amend a permit. Do I have a mover? Councillor Brand to move and Councillor Bond to second. Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I'll be supporting the motion. This is for just a change between an already existing permit and an application for an amendment to it. I think the issues that have been taken up so vociferously in Dinsdale, the Dinsdale residents, they're all valid. They're all valid points, but they're not actually dealt with in this. They're not actually affected in this particular application. The issues of how you treat the back of a commercial area, I think, is a really important one for this city, but this is going to make no difference in that because it has already established what is there, and this makes no actual change to it. Where the changes are is how you treat the front of a commercial area where you have cute little one-storey shops side by side with cute little two-storey shops with 3 and sometimes 4-storey development behind them. How do we apply heritage protection rules to the facades and the fronts of the little shops? Do we apply the 10-degree rule or the 18-degree rule? And in this case, we're proposing to break the 18-degree rule. In my view, in a place like a shopping strip like Vic Avenue, I think it actually, in general form, it's improved by having taller shop fronts. I think that the actual heritage fabric of the particular shop fronts needs to be protected very, very carefully. But I don't think having reasonably presentable building behind it is a problem. And I think that bringing forward a small degree of the bulk of this building will do no damage to the sense of Victoria Avenue as a shopping strip and the preciousness of its shop fronts, and it'll alleviate the pressure on making it bigger at the rear. I think it's just by far the best way of accommodating completely justifiable development on the site. It's a little bit of office and it's one residence. This sort of thing has to be able to happen in places like that, and so this is the best way to make it. So that's why I'm supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Bond.
Just very briefly, if we were assessing this whole application here tonight, my answer might be a bit different, but all we're assessing is the changes to a permit that was granted, I think, 18 months ago for this building. What's before us is just a slight change. We've brought the building forward a little bit. If you're looking at this building from the front, the back or the rear, there isn't too much change to what is already approved, and given we're only judging the change here tonight, I'll be supporting this application, as I don't think it varies all that much from the original approval.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? If not, I will put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move to 7.3. 107A Canterbury Road, Middle Park, which is more commonly known as the Middle Park tram stop. We have 2 speakers. Can I ask Mr. Malcolm Peace? Oh, actually, is David Sofra here? Or Kirby Telling? Okay, Malcolm Peace, please. Please have a seat, turn on the microphone and state your name and suburb, please. And you're the applicant.
Yeah, Malcolm Peace from Yarra Trams in CBD, Melbourne. As the applicant, I'd just like to present to Council the fact that, as per the Council Officer's report, we have put forward the reduction of the awning size because of the fact that we can't comply with the electrical safety rules, which are regulated by Electrical Safety Victoria. We understand that there are a couple of impacts from that have resulted in basically two forms of key objections to that, one being the visual impact that has on the overall building, and the other being the lack of shelter for people waiting on the tram stop. Because of the safety rules, we can't reinstate. We initially intended to reinstate the shelter or the awning as it was. We're unable to do that to be compliant. We tried to get dispensation. We're unable to achieve that. So there's very little we can do about the appearance because we can't reinstate it as it was. The shelter on the platform, however, we are able to undertake installation of a new shelter. So it would be our intent to look at reinstating, or not reinstating, but building a new shelter on the platform. Speaking with council officers, we understand that we do need to get additional planning approval for that, and as such we would do that independently and request planning approval once we've worked through that down the track. And our intent would be to build a shelter that was sympathetic to the existing shelter on the inbound platform on the other side of the tracks. So that's all I had.
Thank you, Mr. Peace. That's the last of the members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions in relation to this item? Councillor Brand.
I'd like just to ask the officer, just for the record, the inability to reinstate the original, the previous canopy. How impossible is it in the circumstances? In terms of administration regulation, what was the applicant up against, and how impossible is it to go against the advice of the regulatory authority on that one?
Well, some of those issues are out of the planning realm, so I couldn't comment on every aspect, but from the evidence that I've received and the advice that I've received and the emails I've received from Yarra Trams, including one quoting Energy Safe Victoria, I think it would be, again, in all practical terms for us sitting in this room tonight, impossible. Nothing is ever impossible, but in a practical sense, I think it would, in the context of this application, be more or less impossible to build as the building previously was.
So if we actually didn't approve the current application and said you've got to go back and then reinstate the original, what would then happen to that position if we took that position?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think there's already approval for, let's call it the large awning, the original scaled awning. The permit applicant would take that plan and that endorsement, I would imagine, both to a building surveyor, an engineer, and the building surveyor would have to get the relevant sign-off from Electrical Safety Victoria. My understanding is that sign-off would not be forthcoming, and so a building permit couldn't be granted. So we'd end up back in the same situation as we are essentially here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Beard. Any further questions? Councillor Bond.
As I say, the St Kilda Railway operated from, I think it was about the 1870s, 1880s, until August 1987, when it was replaced with a light rail, and that operated until January 2018 when it burnt down. How many incidents were there in those 140 years? Correct. that means there was a pressing need to remove the veranda that ironically was the only part of the building that survived the fire. It was still intact at the end of the building. Yet it's the bit that's been removed and deemed dangerous.
The short answer is I'm not aware of any number at all. There might be one, but my understanding is, as is often the case, when a building is destroyed and it has to be rebuilt, it has to comply with current regulations. If the existing awning and building withstood the fire to a greater extent, then it could remain. My understanding is that it's not so much a matter of, just by way of information through you, Madam Chair, it's not a matter of conductivity or those sorts of things. The issue at hand apparently is if someone, in whatever state of mind they may be, gets up on that roof, or someone wants to clean the guttering, them or their broomstick or something might touch the wires and then they would be earthed with however many thousand volts. So regrettably, the awning can't meet the current regulations. It can't be reinstated. It could have had it remained, but it had to disappear.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. Any further questions, councillors? So, do I have a mover for the officer's recommendation or something different? Councillor Bond to move, Councillor Councillor Crawford to second, Councillor Bond.
I know the previous occupant of this building has been waiting a very long time for a permit, so hopefully we grant the permit here tonight, and that previous occupant, given they still have an existing lease over the building, could move back in as soon as possible. It would be nice to see that cafe up and running again.
Thank you. Councillor Crawford. No? Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Brand.
Yes, look, it's a really important asset in our community, this place. It's a fantastic little public asset. It's astonishing to me that it doesn't have heritage protection. But I'm so glad that it's been replaced. It's going to be good. We need it. This sort of regulation, it just drives me crazy that that canopy has been there in that supposedly dangerous state for so long, 100 years, and with no evidence that it's. I mean, if it was really, really dangerous, I think they should have made them take it down. It's one of those things that really drives me crazy. I completely accept that it is the electricity authority's role to keep us safe from all sorts of unexpected places, and we're not going to be able to override them. Therefore, I'll be supporting it, but sort of grinding my teeth while I'm doing it. But there we go. That's what has to happen.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Anyone else? Then I would like to put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Now we'll move to item 7.4, which is 312 Beaconsfield Parade Middle Park. This is to determine an application to amend a planning permit relating to the layout and the design of a 17-dwelling 5-storey building. We've got 4 people that have requested to speak. I'll deal with them in the order that they're here. Stan Brackey, please. Turn on the microphone and please state your name and suburb, please.
My name is Stan Brackey. I reside at number 31 Fraser Street, Middle Park, directly opposite the said dwelling. So, first of all, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address the Planning Committee of the City of Port Phillip this evening. In relation to the planning application, my objection relates to the request to approve the already built roof deck. Therefore, I'd like to put the following points forward to the Planning Committee. Firstly, the roof structure is out of keeping with the surrounding environment. 2, the subject site is zoned General Residential Zone Schedule 2, which allows a maximum building height of 15 metres and a maximum of 5 storeys. The development has exceeded the full height limit as stated in the Design and Development Overlay Scheduled 52DD05-2, with its preferred maximum height of 9 metres plus roof, and an absolute maximum height of 15 metres. There is now a permanent habitable structure erected on the roof with plant and equipment installed above it, taking the additional height of the structure to approximately 21 plus metres, which is well over the 15 metre limit. This new structure also uses the maximum allowed area for plant and equipment of 10% of the roof's surface. I find the description of calling this roof area an observation deck misleading, as it has been designed for outside living. It is a rooftop garden equipped with covered facilities, mod grass, and it no doubt will be used for entertainment areas for the occupants of apartment 17. As I stated in my original objection to the City of Port Phillip in July this year and subsequent emails, this unapproved construction has no regard for the City of Port Phillip's height restrictions of 15 metres for Beaconsfield Parade. In fact, the overall height is now 20 metres, with plant and equipment installed on the top already built extended lift overrun and exit to the outdoor area. The original planning permit issued in early 2015 clearly stipulated the roof was to be used only for the installation of plant and equipment, not human occupation. In real terms, there has been an additional floor constructed on the building. I was the developer who, in 2008, was fined $31,000 by Magistrate Lance Martin in what the City of Port Phillip described as the largest ever detected illegal building works for St Kilda, has no regard for the building codes of the City of Port Phillip. Allowing this illegal construction to be approved makes a mockery of the Council's building codes, which are in place for a reason, and I do not understand why the law-abiding, rate-paying residents have to put up with developers who seem to do what they like and get away with it. However, in an attempt to come to a compromise and assist the Council with its decision, I would be prepared to withdraw my objection if the following conditions of use are listed on the said property's planning permit, where they can be enforceable if conditions are breached. The following points: no more than 16 persons are permitted on the roof deck at any time. There shall be no amplified music on the roof deck. There shall be no additional items permanent or fixed installed on the roof. Lighting of the roof deck shall be properly designed and positioned to avoid spillage on neighbouring properties, and the roof deck to be used between Monday, Friday, 7 a.m, 10 p.m, Friday, 7 a.m, 11 p.m, Saturday, public holidays, 9 a.m. to 11:30 p.m, and Sundays, 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. I am aware that some similar conditions are imposed on the planning permits, especially lighting and hours of use and occupation numbers.
Please come to the end, Mr. Brackey.
Thank you. I now request the above conditions be placed in the amended planning permit as conditions of use, as I believe the simplest way to resolve the matter. Thank you. If this cannot be accepted, I would urge the Council not to approve this aspect of the amendment to the planning permit and not allow human occupation of the space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cal Twite of SJB Planning.
Thank you, Councillors. Kel Twite, SJB Planning, here on behalf of the permit applicant, or the amended permit applicant. Councillors, the application before you seeks a series of minor amendments, the most contentious of which with residents, as you've already heard tonight, concerns the roof terrace, if you like, or roof deck.
Mr. Twite, you're down as an objector. Would you like to wait till all the other objectors have been heard before addressing us, or do you want to just go ahead now?
Preferably I would go last, yes, Councillor. That'd be of assistance to the Council as well.
Yep,
thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll call on Olga Field, please. Welcome. Please state your name and suburb.
My name is Olga Field. I'm the Owners Corporation Manager for 313 Beaconsfield Parade, which is directly opposite the development site. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. In relation to the planning application, our objection relates to the request to approve the already built roof deck and services area. On behalf of the 20 objectors from 313 Beaconsfield Parade, St Kilda West, we put forward the following points, and I think I'm probably reiterating Mr Brackey's points here. The roof structure is not in keeping with the surrounding environment. The subject site is zoned General Residential Zone Schedule 2, which allows a maximum building height of 15 metres and a maximum of 5 stories. I won't go on with the other 2 points, they're exactly the same. There is already a permanent habitable structure erected on the roof with plant and equipment installed above it, taking it to the additional height of the structure to approximately 21 metres, well over the 15-metre limit. The already completed rooftop deck has been specifically designed for the outdoor entertainment purposes to be utilised by the occupants of Lot 17 on the plan of subdivision of that site. The use of such extensive entertainment area will impact greatly on the neighbouring properties by way of amplified noise and light spillage. Previous attempts to impose conditions of use for the rooftop entertainment by way of a Section 173 agreement or a restrictive covenant to be included in the planning permit have not been fruitful. The extension of the rooftop entertainment area allowed to form part of Lot 17 will disadvantage the owners' corporation of that property from restricting the use of that lot if it becomes private property. While the implementation of owners' corporation rules for any property provides a control or limitation of use of common property for those within that property, this does not extend to other neighbouring properties. Owners' corporation rules are also subject to amendment or revocation at any time, in particular where you have a large lot entitlement by any one party. As a way of moving forward, our objectors would agree to revoking their objections if the conditions of the use of the rooftop deck were included in the planning permit as follows. And they're exactly the same as what was announced by Mr Brackey, that no more than 16 persons are permitted on the rooftop deck at any time, no amplified music on the, off the rooftop deck. There shall be no additional items, permanent or otherwise, allowed to be added to the amenities on that rooftop deck. Lighting of the rooftop deck shall be properly designed and positioned to avoid spillage onto the neighbouring properties, and
Please
that
come
there
to the
are
end, Ms.
hours
Field.
of restriction. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms Field. And Mr John Dowling, please. Welcome, Mr Dowling.
Madam Chair, councillors, thank you very much for allowing us to speak on behalf of the objectors in this matter.
If you could state your name and suburb, please.
My name is John Dowling, and I'm representing the objectors in providing them with advice about the grounds for their objection. This is a retrospective application in relation to the permit to ratify changes to building works that were not previously approved by the original permit. The developer's representative, Mr Twite, just spoke a moment ago about minor amendments. The objectors consider them to be major amendments, not minor. The rooftop space that is being proposed to be used as an outdoor living area is in fact an outdoor party space. It is not a backyard as has been described by the officer. It's as big as a house site. It's as big as a full-sized house site. The developer has acknowledged the need for restrictions and limitations upon the use of that space. An agreement has been reached on those terms and conditions as outlined by Mr Brackey. Agreement has been reached in writing between the developer and the objectors on that. The only issue that remains is the means of their enforcement. The developer is not willing to allow the registration of a restrictive covenant on the title which would protect the holders of that covenant, namely the objectors and indeed all others in the building which is the subject of the development. The alternative, of course, equal to a restrictive covenant is the council ratifying a Section 173 agreement which would provide the necessary protection to the residential amenity of the neighbourhood. The objectors trust that the council will acknowledge its responsibilities to represent the ratepayers in protecting that residential amenity in the immediate neighbourhood. The inclusion of the limitations in the council permit will provide some protection. We would ask that the council enter a Section 173 agreement that will be registered on title and therefore run with the land permanently. One more correction to be made, Madam Chair. The council officer has stated that the roof deck, the new roof deck as he describes it, would improve the amenity of future residents of the associated dwelling. There's no question about that. It adds another floor to the associated dwelling as an outdoor living space as part of that dwelling. He goes on to say, without introducing unreasonable amenity impacts upon neighbouring properties. That's the antithesis of what is in fact the case. It would have a detrimental effect upon neighbouring properties to a considerable extent, including those mentioned by Mr Brackey and by Ms Field. That is to say, those at the intersection of Beaconsfield Parade and Fraser Street. And the amenity is more detrimentally affected by reason of it being an outdoor space. If it were an additional story, also not legally ratified by the original permit, it would be less detrimental to the amenity. The fact that it's outdoor living space is what creates the major deficiency in the residential amenity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Dowling. And I'd like to call back Mr Keltwhite, please.
Thank you, councillors. Having heard from the objectors here, I just want to perhaps at the outset be very clear about some things, and that is that the permit applicant, following the consultation meeting, had quite extensive and protracted discussions and negotiations with the objectors without prejudice basis in an attempt to be quite frank about it, not be here tonight. And that was, there was an attempt to try and reach agreement to my client accepting what we consider to be quite onerous conditions and limitations on the use of the roof deck in exchange for the withdrawal of the objections. That hasn't occurred, so we're here tonight. The application before you concerned primarily the matters on the roof. The structures on the roof, the lift overrun, stair overrun, plant, etc., are already approved. What seeks approval here is the reconfiguration of some of that plant area and consolidation and acoustic screens around them, and the use of the roof terrace roof deck itself. So the balustrade, fall protection, whatever you want to call it, is already approved on their plans endorsed by council. The lift core is already approved. It's the reconfiguration of plant, consolidation around it, and acoustic screens around it that approval is sought for here tonight, together with approval of glazing at ground level, which doesn't seem to be in dispute with residents or the like. Importantly, none of the objectors here tonight, or in fact contained in the officer report, are abutting objectors. All objectors are across the road, if you like, or separated from the site. And we would respectfully submit that the use of a private roof deck, it's not a common roof deck for a large number of apartments, but for one apartment, is not an unusual circumstance, particularly in bayside areas, including the city of Port Phillip, and that its use is to be regulated by other pieces of legislation and frankly, good neighbourliness, if you like. And that we would expect it to be used just like other people's backyards, terraces, roof decks and the like. And if there is antisocial behaviour on there, then there are other mechanisms for that to occur. So, councillors, we commend the officer's report here before you tonight, and we respectfully ask that you vote in favour of it.
Thank you, Mr Twite. That's the end of our speakers. Councillors, do you have any questions for the officers? Councillor Bond? Oh, Mr Twite, one of the councillors would like to ask you a question, so we'll go to that first. Councillor Brand.
I just want to clarify something. At one point you were, in a sense, asking council to participate in some form of exercising that agreement just to get it moving on, but now you're not, or am I mistaken?
Sorry, my understanding of council's delegation is that it's a number of objections that brought the matter here before the council tonight. And my client, in an interest of trying to get the matter resolved, if you like, to speak quite openly about this and have the matter resolved, was looking to reach an agreement with the objectors. That agreement couldn't be reached, firstly because the desire by objectors was it to form the basis of a Section 173 agreement, and that requires the council to be party. The agreement has to be reached with the council under that provision of the Act. So that agreement couldn't be reached. My client then attempted to utilise other mechanisms such as owners' corporation rules or the like, and that wasn't to the satisfaction of the objectors. So the objections haven't been withdrawn and we're here tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bond.
One of the speakers mentioned that this building is 21 metres high. I've got the plans in front of me, and I think it's 17.4 metres RL, and the ground level's 2.4, so it works out at 15 metres high, which is the permitted height under the planning scheme for this area. Can you confirm that is the case, and the building isn't 21 metres, and I'm not misreading these plans?
Certainly, Councillor Bond, that's correct. I couldn't, or my client couldn't seek approval for that. It'd be prohibited under the DDO. So yes, the plant and equipment exceeds the 15 metre DDO. That's an allowable encroachment subject to the 10% rule. Thank you.
Councillor Crawford, is your question to the officers? Or? Thank you. Councillor Crawford.
I was wondering, is it normal practice to restrict private open space areas anywhere else in the municipality, or is it only really in I can only recall cases when it's a commercial residence, is that, but I could be mistaken. So I guess the question is, has it occurred anywhere else at a residential private open space?
Mr Spencer.
Through you, Madam Chair. It's not our usual practice to control the use of private open space. I'm not aware of any circumstances whereby we have.
Any other questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation for this Section 72 application. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Bond to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Crawford to second. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Bond?
Yes, I will. There were two elements about this change, and the first one was the rooftop deck, which we've heard a little bit about tonight, and the second element of this change was the extra metre that they built forward on this building without a permit. And I raised this at the consultation we had with the objectors and the developer. I was more concerned about the 1 metre encroachment on the front of the building than I was about the rooftop, but no one's ever raised that as a concern for anyone other than myself, so I won't raise it here tonight. Everyone else seems to have no issues with that. Issue with the rooftop space, I understand the concerns of the residents who live across the road, but fundamentally this is, whether you like it or not, and it may turn out to be a party balcony, and as mentioned, there are other means of dealing with that. But this is private open space, and it's not the role of council here to impose restrictions on what people can and can't do in their private open space. It's no different to a backyard or a balcony. If someone came along to any of us and said, we want to restrict the number of people in your backyard, we want to restrict the number of people in your balcony, or restrict amplified music in your courtyard, I'm sure they'd tell us where to go. So I just don't see why we should sit here and impose this sort of restriction on this particular piece of private open space. There are plenty of other mechanisms if there's noise complaints and things like that. If it does turn out to be the party place that some people fear, there are plenty of other mechanisms in the planning scheme, in our local laws, use of the police that can deal with that at a certain point in time down the track. A Section 173 agreement with council isn't the way to deal with that. And of course, if the developer and the objectors wanted to come some sort of private treaty, that's entirely up to them. Council don't need to be involved in that. So, and they could do that at any time they like. It doesn't need council involvement. So I will be supporting this this application here tonight as recommended by the officer.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Crawford.
I'll just quickly add to that. I do think that there is enough distance between this and the objector's property, which is 30 metres along the road. Like for anyone else, again, as Councillor Bond said, it's hard to restrict what people do in their private open space, and living in flats myself, that's part and parcel of learning to live with each other and managing it. And as you said, there are other mechanisms. So I will be supporting it. As I just don't think we should be inflicting those kind of restrictions. Also ones that it would be very hard for council to enforce, so it would be kind of seemingly token anyway and would not actually, I don't know, hold any power or council have ability to enforce it regularly.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. Would anyone else like to speak to this? Councillor Brand.
Yes, application for retrospective approval of something which has been built is always sticks in one's craw, especially when it's, when it's coming from people who are experienced in the building industry. It is really quite annoying, but nevertheless we have a procedure for dealing with that, which I think is a very fair and reasonable one, which is to say, resubmit, we'll take it back to the original starting point. Would we have approved this? Would we not have approved it? If we would have approved it, fair enough. If we wouldn't have approved it, then there's a problem. So we do have that possibility of always having a hearing to actually make an assessment of what has been built, or after, even if it hasn't been approved. I think it's the only workable way of doing it. I think it's a fair way of doing it too, because there's a huge range between sort of deliberate building against a permit versus right to the other end of a complete, innocent accident, and everything somewhere in that spectrum anyway. So I think this is a completely fair process, even though it annoys me a bit. And I also agree with Councillor Bond's comments and Councillor Crawford's comments about the regulation of private space, open space. So I'll be voting for it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would anyone else like to speak? If not, I will now put the motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Now we'll move to 1 to 5 Tiuna Grove, Elwood. And I think we've got about 13 speakers to this, so I'll be strictly enforcing the 3-minute mark.
Madam Chair, I'll remake my declaration of a conflict and exit the chamber.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Now, I'd like to call Mr. Henry Richardson, please. Welcome, Mr. Richardson. If you could please turn on the microphone, state your name and suburb for the record.
Madam Chair, my name is Henry Richardson from Elwood. Since councillors voted unanimously to reject the applicant's previous proposal, a common statement that has been made by officers and managers of council, as well as the applicant, is that they are satisfied with the reduction in mass and scale. While councillors and council officers will have been able to view the new drawings, the drawings do not do justice the impact that the new development would have. As such, I've created a 3D model, if you'll turn your heads, of the applicant's drawings to better illustrate the immensity of the proposal. To create this model, I've accurately traced over the applicant's drawings at each level and paid close attention to all cross-sections offered. The orange represents the development and the white represents the leftovers from the existing heritage houses. These images will, I think, show to you that it is not sufficient to be satisfied that the scale of the development has been reduced. Next slide, please. I had originally planned to demonstrate an entire fly-around of the model. However, due to the constraints of the presentation, I cannot do that. While there are no viewpoints that the development could ever be described as modest, I will be happy to demonstrate this to any councillors interested after the meeting. Next slide, please. This is the proposed site as seen from above as it stands now. You'll notice that the vast majority of properties consist of single detached dwellings, and any existing apartments are single block and maintain the rhythm of the original subdivision. Next slide, please. This is the 3D model embedded into Google Earth and adjusted for elevation. As you can see, the amended proposal is not only clearly not in line with neighbourhood character, but in fact supersedes the mass of existing developments on Ormond Road, which is a residential growth zone. The trees that protrude in the middle of the development will in fact be gone, as the basement will not allow for any deep root planting there. Next slide. This is a close look at the existing site. And next slide. As the images show, the rhythm of the subdivision is completely disrupted and the development makes little effort to maintain any presence of backyards. Next slide, please. Again, this is the site now. Notice that at 1 Tiuna, the rear 2/3 consist of a single-storey slate-roofed house and a backyard. Next slide, please. The 2/3 1 Tiuna, and the entirety of the backyards of 3 and 5 Tiuna that were previously open air would become development. Further, 3 levels of large windowed habitable spaces of 1A Tiuna will lose all their amenity and privacy, as next slide will show you. This is the space between the development and 1A Tiuna. Note that existing trees will be removed. Next slide, please. The occupants of this apartment of the development will enjoy full access into the lives of the residents at 1A. I note that the applicant has made 0 accommodation for screening for this apartment. Next slide.
Please come to the end, Mr.
Last bit. As the development has been stretched to the absolute boundaries of the site, 4 through 8 Bendigo, all with their primary living areas and bedrooms facing the direction of the development, would no longer experience the expected benefits of living in a neighbourhood residential zone. I respectfully call on all councillors to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Ms. Ruth Jones, please. Oh, Mr. Richardson, Meg Ross has a question for you.
So I just wanted to ask about a question about how you got the data and to do that. It's incredibly impressive, but I just have a question about it.
The way that the model is constructed is I've taken, so on the applicant's drawings there is the ground floor, the first floor, the second floor.
And you use the data points from the plans?
Yes, and I trace over them, so it's about millimetre. If you would have an A1 sheet, of paper, I'm about millimetre, half millimetre precise, so it's not centimetre perfect. In reality, it might be this much different. Yeah. And then I've used the height data that they've entered in, the RL levels. I've also included, not on that model, but you can't see on that model, but I've included the height of the terrain. I've used that for the shadow diagrams, and I've used that to determine at what level it gets put into Google Earth, so that it's accurate.
So some of your work corroborates other bits, like the tracing would be corroborated by the RLs, which would be corroborated by the shadow diagrams.
Yes, it is all perfectly in all intents and purposes, it's to scale of the development.
Right.
And I'll be happy to show it to any councillors afterwards.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ruth Jones, if you could state your name and suburb, please. I think you might need to turn it on. Yep.
Good afternoon. My name is Ruth Jones and I'm a resident of Tiuna Grove, Elwood. I'm speaking tonight on behalf of Housing First, the owners of 1A Tiuna Grove, and also the residents of 1A Tiuna Grove. I would like to also note that the council numbers of objectors do not include the 14 residents of 1A Tiuna Grove who have been joined to the objection, so the number of objectors to this proposal are seriously understated by council officers. Okay, so let's look at Housing First. Housing First believes that the proposal will result in an unreasonable impact on the amenity of dwellings at 1A. It believes this is the case for the following reasons: unreasonable visual bulk by way of limited setbacks of level 1 and 2 from the common boundary with 1A, and these elements are non-compliant with standard B17, and given the physical and strategic context of the site and the degree of sensitivity of the dwellings at 1A, full compliance should be required. There is potential for overlooking into the habitable room windows of a 1A Tiuna Grove. The proposed building is at odds with the existing and preferred neighbourhood residential character. It is away from Ormond Road. It is located within a neighbourhood residential zone. The proposed driveway is located adjacent to 1A Tiuna Grove. It's a potential source of noise and light spillage and will degrade the amenity of residents at 1A. These are at odds with the outcomes sought for this site in the Port Phillip planning scheme. Now I'd like to move to the personal statement made by residents of 1A Tiuna Grove. Lisa Pham, who had intended to give this statement tonight, is ill and is unable to be here tonight, which is why I'm speaking in her stead. Our property is adjacent to the proposed development. Our community is made up of residents with vulnerabilities. Some are elderly, some have health conditions. It is our home. Others cannot work due to disability. Others are retired. All of us spend the majority of our time at home. It is our haven. As long-term residents who have finally found stable and affordable housing, we are not in a position to relocate. The residents' objections are unreasonable visual bulk, visually oppressive building looking right into habitable rooms. The effect is compounded by the loss of indirect light and makes our living spaces dark and claustrophobic. Tremendous loss of privacy.
Please
the
come to
setback
the end,
is
Ms.
non-compliant. Increased noise. Residents will have reduced access to emergency services. The scale of the development will compromise and diminish our ability, diminish our amenity and quality of life. We urge the Council to reject the development. I'd like to repeat just the earlier statement on behalf of those residents. All of us spend the majority of our time at home. It is our haven. As long-term residents who have found affordable and stable housing, we are not in a position to relocate. We ask you to reject this application.
Thank you, Ms Jones. Councillor Brand has a question for you, Ms Jones, if you wouldn't mind.
Could you just indicate where 1A Tiuna Grove is in this?
It is. It's the building on the extreme left of the picture. I should note that the boundary of the new building, the proposed new building, is much closer to 1A Tiuna Grove than is currently the case.
The boundary?
So the boundary between the buildings has shrunk, and the building is taller by a metre, and it runs the full length of the block. Please help.
1A, I just...
The space between the buildings has shrunk.
Yes, I'll ask the officers. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. Reid Morrill, please. Lisa Richardson and Mark Richardson. I have you together, is that correct? Just come on your own?
Yep. Send my speech. I'm just looking for my slide. This is mine. Yep. Thank you.
Great.
So,
thank you. Please state your name and suburb again, please.
Yeah, thank you. So, Madam Chair and councillors, thank you for the opportunity to talk tonight. My name is Lisa Richardson, and I have been a resident of Elwood in my present home since 1990. I have come here tonight to bring attention to just one issue that will be caused by the proposed development. The issue being that many mature trees will be lost if this building proceeds on 1 to 5 Tiuna Grove. Next slide, please. This is the view from my kitchen and family room at the rear of my home. Each day I open my back door, which steps out to an open wooden deck, and listen to the sound of birds. For those who know me, know that I enjoy pottering around in my back garden. I venture out there many times a day. With the recent climate emergency motion, it would be wonderful if we could be proactive now to save our mature trees, to retain wildlife and greenery within the neighbourhood. Next slide, please. I am deeply distressed that the proposed development will be seeing mature trees cut down, promoting a concrete jungle and light pollution in my backyard. This slide illustrates the greenery we have now. So next slide, please. This slide demonstrates the laneway amenity we currently enjoy and the flow of backyards. So next slide, please. This is a list of trees that are to be removed. You will notice there are mature trees, including Victorian natives. I respectfully call on all councillors to refuse this application 1 to 5 Tiuna Grove. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Richardson. Helen Custis, please. Where is he? Oh, my apologies, did I miss Mark?
Are you sure?
Oh, right.
Okay. My name is Helen Custis and I have lived at 6 Bendigo Avenue since 1993. The house has been in my family since 1976. As an Elwood resident of 43 years, I urge you to reject the proposed application. It is ill-conceived and fails to meet the Council's objective of neighbourhood character as enshrined in the NRZ 6 and the Port Phillip planning scheme. The scheme identifies key planning challenges as the loss of existing single dwellings. Quote, it imposes strategies that seek to maintain, and I quote, the distinctive suburban character, including large front and rear setbacks in established gardens and low-rise building form. The application represents an abject failure to meaningfully address these objectives, in particular in view of the unprecedented side-to-side consolidation of 3 residential blocks resulting in a visually oppressive built form which will wrap around into the rear of heritage properties in a minimal growth zone. This is compounded by the fact that it's now set largely on the boundary with minimal landscaping opportunities for a length of 50 metres. In fact, the amended plans have reduced the rear setbacks, which have increased the negative impacts on my family's privacy and amenity. The development will face directly into our private living areas and private open space, where we spend the majority of our time. It stretches across the entirety of our rear boundary. When we renovated, we reoriented our main living areas to face the rear of our property, consistent with the heritage overlay that we occupy as well. So essentially what we have now, our house is an open plan elevated wall of glass facing directly onto 3 and 5 Tiuna Grove. The development will dominate the view from all of our living areas. This impact is amplified by the fact that there are no visual impediments on our property to act as a natural break. An attempt at articulation to the rear is tokenistic at best. It's not meaningful and does nothing to address the visual bulk and oppressiveness of the development. Our extension is designed to benefit from passive solar. It acts as a heat sink during winter, helping us to reduce our carbon emissions. Climate emergency declaration, anyone? The development will result in a loss of these benefits as those areas will be shaded in winter. Further, and on many measures, the proposal is not a good neighbour. It does not provide future occupants with the amenity they reasonably expect in an NRZ within a heritage overlay. It borrows from and detracts from our amenity, that of a detached dwelling in a landscape setting. When we renovated our home, we consulted heavily with council and our neighbours, a courtesy that has not been extended to us. We're especially disappointed that council officers have diminished and dismissed our legitimate concerns. None of us are naive. We know we don't have a right to a view. We do, however, have a reasonable expectation that our amenity should feature in Council's deliberations. In this regard, the NRZ zone objectives are clear.
Please come to the end, Ms Custis.
The application will have significant ongoing detriment to my family's amenity, and in addition, if approved, it undermines Council's explicit policies developed in consultation with the community that would have real, inescapable and endurable impacts across Elwood and Port Phillip. I urge you to reject this application.
Thank you, Ms Custis. One quick question. Yes, Councillor Brand.
I just want to establish where your house is. Are you directly across the lane from where the
Yes.
3 and 5, Tiuna, where the two-storey
our
bit
property basically faces directly into 3 and 5 and vice versa across that laneway.
So your prospect will be that two-storey bit that goes along near the back fence. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Mark Richardson. Welcome back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and councillors, I have a presentation titled Losing Backyards. There you go. Thank you very much. Mark Richardson, Elwood. Tonight I'd just like to talk about the loss of backyards associated with this proposal. We're all familiar with Tiuna Grove, such a charming little scrumptious street. Delegated, it almost doesn't belong in Elwood. It's so sweet in comparison to elsewhere. It's a short street. There's only 11 properties on either side of the street. This proposal will result in a significant reduction of the number of backyards remaining in that street. Council's various policies and zonings identify rear setbacks and garden characters as key to Elwood's character, and I think we all know that, and that they are at risk. So I ask myself, why does Council codify its concerns? And I think I know. Have a look at the backyard. The next slide, please. So this is a view of my backyard, which I had to take from inside the house because I don't have a fancy camera with a wide field of view, so I'm running from left to right. But it's nothing special. It's just an ordinary backyard, but it does provide external living space for the 4 kids as they've grown up to run around, and it's a space that, of course, is shared in terms of overview by others. But the proposed development doesn't have a backyard at all, as you know. Next slide, please. So this is all about trying to illustrate here tonight the loss of neighbourhood backyards. This is an image that was created and paid for to submit as expert evidence to VCAT for the previous design of building. So that's a 3-storey building continuing along. Again, the angle of view of the camera wasn't wide enough to capture the full width of my backyard. This property is now lower from about where the terracotta pots are against my grey fence there. So the 3-storey sections to the right, 2-storey to the left as currently proposed. However, the whole building is much closer. So the 3-storey section on the right there is now 2 metres closer and set back only 2 metres from the lane, and to the left there it's right on the lane. The garden bed is as provided, is inadequate for the proposed foliage to have any effect, because there's a basement right under there going all the way to the boundary. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that's it. In a nutshell, I'm trying to take this opportunity to allow you to see an aspect that you may not have seen before. This is evidence that was created by professionals, not the same design. The windows are in different positions and so on of the current proposal, but that does give you a sense of the enormous overlooking that would happen to all properties at the rear. But this isn't about the overlooking, it's about there's no backyard. Thank you very much. Please reject this proposal.
Right on time. Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson. Ms. Christine McLaughlin, please. Welcome. Please state your name and suburb.
Christine McLaughlin. I'm at number 2 Tiuna Grove, which is effectively opposite where the car park entrance to this proposed development is, the car park entry. I'd like to address a different point, which is the quality of the proposed apartments in this development. Make some points. The apartment numbers 3, 4 and 5 are all set 1.5 metres below the natural ground level of the lane. Refer Delegates Report, page 38. The ceiling height is 2.7 metres, so there is more living space below natural ground level than above it. Courtyards for 3, 4 and 5 will have a finished fence height of 3.5 metres, 1.5 metre below ground level, plus the 2.2 metre high fence. Facing east, this area will get no direct daylight. The shadow diagrams show that the windows to the west for apartments 4, 5, 9 and 10 are partially shadowed for much of the day at the spring equinox. While planning laws does not require that shadowing is assessed in winter, there will be even more shadow cast by the second story additions of 3 and 5 Tiuna. So these comments are about the actual quality of this development that the developers are proposing. Final point on that issue, apartments 5 and 10 are directly behind 5 Tiuna Grove. Number 5 has a lounge games area at the rear of the second floor. The large window is shown as being unscreened. The private open space of apartments 5 and 10 are overlooked by this large window, affording no privacy. This is a comment about those who would be the current and future residents of this proposed development, very poor quality of living in comparison to the surrounds. My other comment would be that Tiuna is a tiny street. You've seen the pictures. Parking and traffic management will be affected. I know that's not the council's view, but it's impossible for that not to be the case. This overdevelopment affects communities. Communities are less connected when there's this overdevelopment. Less connected communities are less safe communities. They're communities where loneliness and homelessness and all these issues that are very important, I think, in this council, should be to this council, are impacted. The health of the neighbourhood is actually impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McLaughlin. Councillor Brand has a question for you.
We just go back to the previous slide. Where is that brick wall and that corrugated fence located?
That's in the lane. Where is it going?
Corrugated fence is number 8.
That's 8 Bendigo.
That's the other side of the lane. Yes, that's the other. So we're saying the development site's here with the bushes coming out. Correct. Yeah. And
where the new fence is. See the newer fence.
Mr. Spencer, You're right, that's the development.
Okay, and that's the same fence just further down the lane.
What are you trying to establish, Councillor Brand?
I'm just trying to understand where. I'm just getting an idea of who's facing onto what when people come and talk about how they're going to be affected. I just want to know who's behind these fences, and are they?
So that laneway is that's the back of Bendigo Avenue, and on the right-hand side, that's into Tiuna Grove, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the development site here is where
on the right,
just where the brown rather than the greenish sort of fence is. So that's further down from the development. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Ms McLaughlin. Matthew Harrison, please.
Matthew Harrison, 8 Bendigo Avenue, Elwood. I would firstly like to address the issue of precedent that approval of this development is likely to create. The approval of this development would set a precedent that will not only impact on the residents gathered here tonight, but the many residents who will come after us, objecting to similar backyard swallowing developments. Nowhere in a neighbourhood residential zone with heritage overlay has side-to-side consolidation across the rear of adjoining lots been permitted. It creates an L-shaped lot. I'd just like to draw your attention to the photo there, and at the top, at the left area, is the proposed development. And you'll see there's many other similar backyard strips running across multiple lots that could also just as easily be developed with the same strategy if this proposal is approved. That's only one small snapshot of our locality. In fact, the next slide is just a little bit further down, and you'll see there's many more that run all the way through to Ormond Road and Glen Huntly as well. So on a macro scale, this could be rolled out right across the suburb. The reason that these developments haven't been approved is that heritage sightline and visibility performance measures have prevented this. In this case, it is proposed by the applicant that these provisions are relaxed to allow this development to proceed. This includes large protruding zinc-clad box additions to the heritage houses, removal of most of the chimneys and a monolithic apartment complex at the rear. The planning report prepared by council officers does not adequately address this contravention and seeks to gloss over this aspect. It incorrectly states that the modifications to the houses will be inside the existing roof spaces. If this goes ahead, we see no limit to this strategy being rolled out over heritage and neighbourhood areas across the suburb. If council supported this type of development, it would create an impression that there are two sets of rules, one to residents and another to well-resourced developers. Speaking from personal experience of adding a rear extension to our property, we were tightly restricted to comply with the heritage provisions, and there was no question of visibility from the street being allowed. Many other residents have raised similar concerns with me. Such an approval would feed concerns that council favours developers, not the residents who are not resourced with legal teams and consultants. I would like to point out that Elwood Tiuna Proprietary Limited, the registered owner of these properties, is ultimately 49% owned by Hobie Land, a large Singaporean-based international property developer with property assets in excess of $5 billion. The registered applicant at VCAT, Tiuna Developments, is ultimately 60% owned by Hobie Land, whose owners are in the Forbes 200 rich list. We question council as to why the planning scheme rules should be relaxed for this foreign entity when local residents receive no such favours. This development is in the wrong location.
Please come to the end, Mr Harrison.
This is an NRZ zone with heritage overlay and minimal growth objective. I would like to quote from the original officer's report rejecting this application. The report states, it is considered that the site does not neatly align with any of the housing growth definitions given the area. It is not proximate to a major activity centre, it is not on a main road, nor does it front Ormond Road or Glen Huntly Road. What is clear, however, is that the site is not within a preferred housing growth area that is designated for change. This site fits best with a minimal growth area given the heritage overlay provisions. We ask councillors to continue to reject it.
Thank you very much, Mr Harrison. I'd like to call Roberto Shooter, please. Welcome. Please state your name and suburb.
My name is Robert Shooter and I live in St Kilda East. Councillors, tonight I am representing members of our arts community. Over the last months I've read numerous documentation in regard to this proposed development. Sadly, there is one important essential element that has been neglected and overlooked. It's in two words: cultural significance. It might not mean much to you, but it means a lot, the cultural significance of the community. I quote, cultural significance means aesthetic, historic, scientific, social value for the past, present and future generations. This has not been considered in this case. There's been no assessment of cultural importance of number 3 Tiuna Grove. The proposed movie set facades do not fit into the heritage planning of the City of Port Phillip. The demolition of the rear of number 3 is inappropriate and unacceptable. The rear features of the house features the beautiful and fated Red Room that's been the hub of Melbourne's art and theatre communities for over 3 decades. It has been responsible for nurturing, creating and producing many famous plays, films and artworks. It's also responsible for the careers of many well-known artists, actors, directors and writers from Mirka Mora to Albert Tucker. The legendary La Mama has also staged plays in the back garden for the community, for the City of Port Phillip. Our arts community does not condone the destruction of our historical and cultural history for the benefit of greedy developers with the appetite for profit. Paul Cox's former home in Albert Park has been saved and preserved. So should number 3 Tiuna Grove. We have to only look at the Greyhound Hotel debacle to witness the vanishing of so many of our heritage dwellings. Finally, the community, I had over hundreds of emails concerning this development. The community rejects the development and requests that the council take a stand and preserve the future of our historical heritage natures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Tutor. Miss Lynn Harrison, please. Welcome.
Lynn Harrison, and I have a presentation. Sure. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. I'd like to make 2 points. Firstly, the enormous number of local people who passionately oppose this development. And secondly, I want to speak about the local anger regarding the compromised outcome proposed for the heritage houses at number 3 and 5 Tiuna. Next slide, please. Oh, that's fine. Back. Thanks. 59 objectors originally opposed the initial plans. 2,500 signed the petition to protect the houses at 3 and 5. The VCAT files were inspected on Monday, and I can report there are now 60 filed objections, plus an additional one of 14, including 14 people. As Elvis mentioned earlier, there's another 458 that signed the most recent petition. The voice of opposition has only got stronger. This takes me to my second point. Heritage is more than keeping a front facade and a small amount of brick side wall. The practice note for applying heritage overlay is clear. The heritage included in a suburban allotment includes the whole of the allotment. The practice note, which I have here, refers to this as curtilage. It's a new word for me, but it simply defines the whole of the allotment is part of the heritage. Port Phillip's own policy, 21.6-2 for the local strategy vision, is to maintain the distinctive suburban character, including large front and rear setbacks, established gardens and low-rised form. Next slide, please. I call on all councillors to recognise that the heritage protection afforded by the Minister includes the whole of the sites. A consolidation across the backyards and continuing into a third allotment are contrary to this. Next slide, please. I also wish to convey the feeling of loss in relation to the partial demolition of the houses which have only just recently been granted heritage protection. The Delegates report states that the sightline performance measures have been met. This is at odds with the applicant's own heritage advisor, who says it is not. In this matter, I'm in agreement with the applicant. The sightlines policies have not been met for number 5 Tiuna. Please look at my drawing. I'm sorry, it's just a snip out of the drawing, so it's not that clear. The heritage performance measures require sightlines to be taken from the gutter or the base of the front parapet. This is taken from page 43 of the Delegate report. The plans show that the sightline has been taken from the highest ridge line. By redrawing at the gutter line and using my protractor, you can see that the second storey box should be recessed lower or substantially further back. Next slide, please. The proposed extensions to the 2 homes are not an empathetic response of a local resident designing a home for a long-term family use. It's simply a guess by a developer who is maxing out the built area on every conceivable extra: a pool, a gym, a games room, home cinema, 3-car garage, etc., etc. It's entirely speculative. The demand exists for large houses that sit inside a strata plan structure together with an apartment block. The partial demolition includes removal of chimneys. The Port Phillip Council policy opposes removal of chimneys, and it is used as an example of heritage control on the council website. There's conflicting information from all parties regarding the chimneys. We have Anita Brady's report from the applicant, which is conceding that there seems to be chimneys will be lost. We have the council officer's report asking for clarification, yet there is no clarification as to what chimneys are being removed. We have the heritage policy noting that heritage elements shouldn't be removed. In summary, a few token changes to balustrading and the front veranda posts do not overcome the substantial amounts of demolition proposed. The loss of the chimneys and the roof elements, a built form in excess of policy limits, and a crowding of the new development into the valued open spaces. Councillors, I respectfully call for you to refuse this application.
Thank you, Ms Harrison. Liz Johnson, please.
Yeah, Liz Johnston, Elwood, and I've successfully avoided sitting here and facing you for over a decade, so it's taken a lot to get me back here on a planning matter, but I actually think you're at a fork in the road. Port Phillip has invested so much time, so much money and so much care for so long to develop a very robust, fine-grained planning scheme. And this one to me is a no-brainer, and I am staggered that the officers are not recommending refusal to you tonight. So I should also say I've been asked to speak for John Denton at VCAT, who's the owner of Tiuna, responsible for the subdivision in Tiuna Grove. Now, I guess I'd say I know planning's hard and I know things must be determined on balance and decisions need to be made with the policy before you, but often, as we've seen from evidence cited from the applicant's own reports, it's about how you use the tools available to defend your policy, and I guess that's what we're asking you to do tonight. There's no compromise that can be found here through conditions. We've looked, we've tried. It's ill-conceived and it's in the wrong location. Detached dwellings and policy to retain them isn't an elitist approach for Elwood. Elwood has only about 12% detached dwellings, yet they define our streetscapes and anchor our character. And, for example, in Bendigo Avenue we've got 30 lots, all but 5 are single dwellings except 5. So that's atypical for Elwood. That's 48% of the dwellings in the street. It's important to think about Tiuna Grove that already has 70 apartments, only has 9 detached dwellings. That is typical Elwood. It is about balance. And so the retention of only the front rooms on these sites is their effective loss. And they really provide the amenity for the flats around them and help anchor and define the character of Port Phillip. I looked up the census to see how you're going in your vision to conserve and enhance the architectural and cultural heritage of Port Phillip. 400 homes have been lost between 2011 and 2016 in Elwood alone. It's not travelling well. A lot more are going to be lost because much of Elwood is unstable reclaimed land. A lot of Elwood is under SBOs and replacement dwellings will need to be different. It's really important here, where it's old Elwood, Elwood Hill, that you keep the heritage buildings where you have the choice and the policy that enables you to do so. I'm not going to quote your policy back to you. It's in the report and it's unambiguous, and the go-go, slow-go and no-go zones that have come in to create an argument for minimal change in this area were born in Port Phillip. They were put there by you and your advocacy years ago to enable more control and more certainty about delivering minimal change. So I would urge you to refuse this application. You've heard all the arguments around culture, heritage, traffic, the poor amenity, the 50-metre walk to the front door of the poor apartment all the way down and to the right, the lack of natural light and those other factors that impact on amenity. But I really encourage you to not accept the officer's recommendation. If you don't feel confident to refuse it tonight, to defer it, to get more information, to actually go down and look at the site, consider the internal amenity of what's being proposed to be built wrapping around the front rooms of the facades that are left. And please stand by your policy, stand by your scheme and support the depth of feeling that exists in the community, because the arguments could go either way and I think you really should refuse it, please.
Thank you, Ms Johnson. Bella De Brera, please.
Hello, good evening, Madam Chair, councillors. I didn't prepare anything, but I'm so driven to speak that I just filled out a form earlier. My objection is
Can you state your name again?
Sorry, Bella De Brera. I live in Bendigo Avenue, number 2.
My objection is mostly moral to this. We have established really beyond a shadow of doubt that this is a complete monstrosity and completely out of place in this street. As far as I'm aware, there is no major shortage of housing in Elwood, so the only explanation for this development is money. And as we all know, the more flats there are, the more people there are to pay their council taxes, which are very high in the city of Port Phillip. It's a moral duty of the councillors to reject this proposal. I note that a number of the councillors are keen advocates of social justice and climate change and the environment. This is a gross social injustice if this is allowed to proceed, so I firmly and strongly would propose that this proposal is rejected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bearer. And now we have the applicant, please, Mr. Simon Martin.
Thanks, councillors. Simon Martin here on behalf of the permit applicant, McKim. Councillors, I sat here before you back in June requesting that you did not proceed with the interim heritage control over this site. This failed to materialise, with the interim heritage control being implemented on the 4th of July and Amendment C174 proceeding thereafter. The outcome of these events has significantly ramified our proposed development as has shaped the journey that we've decided to take upon since that 4th of July ruling. Once the dust settled, our client decided to accept the umpire's call, albeit not agreeing with the process taken by council, and we have chosen to pursue a significantly amended application. This has included varying the application from a 3-storey apartment building comprising 22 apartments and 44 car parking spaces over basement to a 2 to 3-storey apartment building comprising 12 apartments, the retention and restoration of number 3 and 5 Tiuna Grove dwellings, and a modified basement of only 22 dwellings, or 22 car parking spaces, should I say. The amended scheme represents a significantly reduced and compromised development outcome for the site and for our client, from a yield, built form and financial perspective. This amended scheme has, however, been designed working closely with Council's internal departments and planning department. Significantly importantly, heritage, urban design, traffic and landscaping are all supportive of this amended scheme. I'll just pluck a few quotes from the heritage referral comments that are contained within the delegate report, and I quote and note, "The extent of demolition is acceptable, and on balance, this amended design represents good heritage outcomes for the site and one which is supportable from a heritage perspective." Council's urban designer further also says, and I quote, "From an urban design perspective, the proposal is supportable." On the basis of all internal experts of Council being supportive of the amended scheme, and Council's own planning officers stating that the amended scheme also complies with both state and local planning provisions of the Port Phillip planning scheme, it is only fair and reasonable in our view that the councillors support the officer's recommendation today and ultimately this application at December's hearing. I would also flag, councillors, just the accuracy of the first speaker's render or massing material that was presented to you tonight. This differs significantly from our rendering and massing diagrams that were put forward as part of the amended scheme, which are generated using CAD. The accuracy of them 100%. They're also verified by Orbit, who are an independent massing and render company. I'd also query the validity and also intent of flagging renders of the previous scheme in supporting arguments before you tonight. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, councillors, and I thank you for your time and ongoing interest in this application.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Councillor Brand, you've got your microphone on. Does that mean you want to ask a question? No. Does anyone want to ask a question of the applicant? Councillor Simic, a question of the officers.
Can officers just provide a very brief overview for sake of making sure that everyone's on the same page of what exactly happened at VCAT and why this matters before us tonight, and exactly on which parts of the application we're making a decision?
Mr. Spencer.
Through you, Madam Chair.
It has a long drawn-out history. There was the initial application was received by council. It was refused under delegation. The permit applicant subsequently lodged an application for review with the tribunal. In the process of that, the permit applicant then amended their plans through the VCAT process. Council officers were not supportive of those plans. Then after that, there was an application under Section 29A of the Building Act to demolish the buildings at 3 and 5, Tiuna Grove. Council then put an interim heritage overlay on the site. The permit applicant has since come back with the plans that we're looking at considering tonight, and they were also amended through the VCAT process.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Crawford.
Can I ask clarification? Does heritage overlay apply to the whole of the land or just the building itself? I'm not clear on that one, please.
The heritage overlay applies to all of the land. Except one Tiuna Grove. It applies to 3 and 5 Tiuna Grove.
Any further questions, councillors? Councillor Brand.
Okay. I have quite a lot of questions. I'm going to try and work through sort of going backwards from some of the questions. Some of the questions I believe I probably know the answer to, but I think they need to be spelt out in public, and some of the questions I don't know the answer to, and some of them have been raised as fresh issues which I haven't grasped at all yet. The question that Ms Johnson raised in passing was the zoning of the area, the no-go, slow-go, go-go sort of slogan which we had about 15 years ago still somehow persists, and this is somehow in a no-go or a slow-go area. How do you characterise the requirement for minimal change, and how do we minimal growth? Is it minimal? Whatever it says, how do you characterise that, and how do you justify the change from currently, I guess there are 8 dwellings on the site, up to 14 proposed?
Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Chair. In regard to the minimal growth zone referred to in the planning scheme, so that's with respect to clause 2104, an assessment of applications within the minimal growth area effectively default to the heritage considerations. So basically what that says is that all new development shall be in accordance with the Port Phillip Heritage Policy at clause 22.04. So having regard to that, minimal residential growth area definition basically states that the development is to be minimised in order to retain recognised heritage values. No numerical rate is suggested. It is considered, and officers have considered this proposal, and we believe that the development appropriately responds to the relevant heritage policy as noted in the delegate report.
Thanks, Mr McClellan. Further questions, Councillor
Yes.
Brand?
How would an application on one of those sites for, say, a dual occupancy, or even a triple occupancy proposal be handled on it? How would that fit into this formulation?
So there'd be varying requirements to take into consideration, not to mention there'd be, I imagine, a completely different configuration of access and egress, etc. So it would be considered under the regular policies as this has been, including the zoning.
Just on that, is there any hard and fast figure about the number of extra dwellings that can be put onto a single dwelling property?
Through you, Madam Chair, not in this instance. No, there's no numerical figure put to it.
Okay. Another question: have we got conditions dealing with the question of whether chimneys are going to be preserved?
Mr Spencer.
Through you, Madam Chair. There was some additional information that was provided by provided to all parties post the preparation of this report. Those plans indicate that there would be one chimney at number 5, Tiuna Grove, that would be demolished, and that chimney is at the rear of the site.
So are our conditions, in your view, tight enough to preserve all chimneys except the one at the rear?
Yes, that's what the plans show, and that's what they'll need to comply with.
Can I keep on going? There were some sightline diagrams shown, derived, I think, from the applicant's sightline diagrams. I wonder if you could, in particular relationship to visibility at number 5. I don't think the visibility at number 3 is particularly controversial, but at number 5 it probably is. Can you comment on those sightline diagrams, where they're drawn from? They seem to be incorrect in almost every regard, but I don't know what would be correct and what would be required, and how our assessment that the additional volume complies with our heritage requirements.
Through you, Madam Chair. Firstly, yes, the diagrams are incorrect by the applicant, and where the sightline is taken by objector, by Ms Harrison is also incorrect. The sightline needs to be taken at the top of the gutter where it intersects with the main facade. That's where I sought advice from Council's Heritage Advisor just to confirm that I was taking the sightline from the correct location. He confirmed that I was, and I stand by the accuracy in the report. There may be 1 or 2 degrees out, but given the scale of the plans, it's a little bit difficult to get it to the minute or the second or the degree.
So the bulk of the rear additions to that house are clearly still visible on either side of the pitched roof. So can you just go over the relevance of sightlines and how that was deemed to be an acceptable outcome?
Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, I can. So the part of the heritage policy talks about additions and or alterations to heritage places. There is a policy that says an upper storey addition is sited and massed behind the principal facade so that it is preferably is not visible, particularly in intact or consistent streetscapes. This is not considered a consistent streetscape, so I'll note that first and foremost. Secondly, Performance Measure 1 provides a strategy in which you can meet that objective. It's much like an objective to Res Code, where it has a standard. If you meet the standard, you meet the objective. In this instance, the strategy, let's say the standard, is met. It's under the 18 degrees, and therefore the objective is met. The objective of the policy is met. I might just add, Councillor, that through you, Madam Chair, that the heritage policy does not talk about invisibility, must be invisible. It talks about limiting visibility, and it acknowledges as part of its objective to ensure that new development and any publicly visible additions and or alterations to a heritage place maintains the significance of the heritage place. So it recognises that changes to heritage places will be visible in some circumstances.
So on a more general question, it was claimed, well, it was stated that the heritage regulations applying to this particular application have been relaxed for it in a way that may not have been relaxed to other applications in the area from residents to put additions on the back of their house. I'm just wondering if you can point to any aspect of this application of heritage regulations that have been relaxed in any particular way. I know there's an issue of discretion and how that works, so that's probably part of your answer.
Through you, Madam Chair. No.
I'd also like to ask a question. Yes, just give you a break there, Councillor Brand. We had an objector talk about the arts from the arts community, talking about cultural significance in particular from around the Red Room and some things that have occurred there. Are you able to speak to the significance of the Red Room and whether this would qualify under a cultural significance component?
The statement of significance for the site makes no mention of the Red Room. The heritage overlay, the schedule to the heritage overlay does not contain any internal controls on either of these sites, and it's unusual for heritage properties to have internal controls. There are some in the city of Port Phillip, but in circumstances such as this, it would be surprising if there was an internal control.
Mrs Spencer, do you know if the Red Room still exists?
I'm not sure that it's still red, and I'm assuming that it does still exist, but I don't know. I haven't been inside the property, but I have heard that it's no longer red.
Councillor Brand.
There was an image presented before of with the image of the previous part of the previous application shown behind the fence line. I'm just wondering if you could comment on the relevance or accuracy or relevance of that image, and there's a couple of details I'd like to ask you about. In some of the images in the application, it shows trees along the back facade of the three-storey section at number 1, and that image, for instance, didn't show any trees. I'm just wondering if if I'm mistaken about the trees, or whether there are going to be greenery between the development and the fence line at that stage.
So, in terms of the usefulness and/or accuracy of the image that was put up on the screen, sorry, through you, Madam Chair, that was put up on the screen earlier, as stated by Mr. Harrison, it related to the previous proposal. This proposal is different to the previous proposal in that it's 3-storey in part and has a much greater proportion than is 2-storey. So I would question the value in that image in terms of depicting what we're here considering tonight.
He did say that only half of it was true, in the sense that half of it would be 2-storey instead of 3, but it did show no greenery, and I do have an elevation here on the applicant's drawing with trees at least some of the way along the rear elevation. I'm just wondering whether those trees are actually viable, or whether they're part of the deal, or whether they're just a decorative addition which with no reality.
Through you, Madam Chair. Sorry, Councillor, I didn't address that second part of your last question. There's a landscape plan that has been provided as further information to the application that includes there's planter boxes around the perimeter of the first floor and the second floor, and there's trees at ground floor as well. And within the terrace, I'll just take you to the terrace. So the terrace to apartment 11, which is on sheet A007, there's some large planter boxes around that terrace, including some quite significant plantings of trees, small trees.
I can maybe simplify the question a bit more. Looking at 007 there, is that right? Which is the plan. You can see all the way along the back lane, the fence line along the laneway, there's quite a lot of pale green shown. None of it planted with trees, as opposed to the elevations which show trees. But most of the back of the the three-storey development at number 1, and about 2/3 of the back of number 3, and maybe maximum a half at the back of number 4, are areas of green. And are they plantable areas, is what I'm probably trying to find out, or are they areas where I haven't seen the landscape, or I haven't looked at the landscape plan if it's available. I'm just wondering, are these areas which can be landscaped with significant greenery?
Through you, Madam Chair. The part of the ground floor courtyard to sorry, I'm finding it difficult to read these plans. To the middle dwelling, let's call it, which would be apartment 4 at ground floor. Part of that courtyard is a deep soil area, so there's no basement below that.
I'm sorry, just have to say that again to me, where it is.
Apartment 4, the courtyard, abutting the rear boundary. Part of that courtyard is an area for deep soil planting, so there's no basement underneath it. You're probably best to have a look at the basement plan, which shows you the areas of deep soil planting, and that's at A004.
I'm sorry, we don't interact with the public at this stage.
Two small areas of deep soil planting. One is right at the corner, and one is sort of directly behind number 3.
That's correct. At both corners and in the middle of the rear elevation.
Okay, right. Councillors, are there any other questions? Councillor Crawford.
So, because it only has interim heritage protection, if we refuse this application and then the heritage goes, there is a risk that the heritage, it could be replaced by. So this is, I guess I'm asking, there is a risk at refusing this that the heritage may not be saved down the track. I don't know what the question is. I'm trying to assess, there is risk by refusing this application that the heritage may not, interim may not come, the heritage may come through on it, so you may lose those houses 3 and 5.
In the event that the Minister does not place permanent heritage controls over the site, then, and this development has not been constructed, then there would be no control over the demolition of the properties.
Any last questions, councillors? Councillor Brand?
I'm sorry to keep on going, but it is actually important to me, and I think important to us, that we hear the answers to these challenges to the application and explore them a bit. And so I'm sorry if it's taking so long, but I just think it's important. Ruth Jones spoke on behalf of Housing First at 1 Tiuna Grove, an area which I don't recall seeing. I don't recall, or maybe I just skipped it because I thought it was dealt with. I'm not quite sure. The setbacks along the northern boundary between number 1 and number 1A. I'm interested to know how they rate in terms of the res code setbacks, the normal regulations that would apply to any development on that site in relation to the property next door, and how they compare with what's there now.
Mr. Spencer?
There is non-compliance with the B17 setback, minor non-compliance. Now, council officers believe a variation to that setback is appropriate. The key considerations relate to daylight to neighbouring windows and relate to the visual bulk impacts. Now, in terms of daylight to windows, the daylight to windows standard is met. In terms of visual bulk, at present, number 1A, the residents of number 1A have an outlook to a sheer 3-storey wall that is punctuated by windows with no screening. The situation that would occur, the situation that's proposed in this instance is for screening. There is also a condition on the permit, there's a recommended condition to put a solid wall next to the basement driveway to attenuate noise and fumes. So it's, and also there's also some planter boxes along that element as well. So it's officers' belief that it's actually an improved situation at that interface.
Okay, and the interface with 1A Tiuna, I don't even know how to pronounce it, pertains to just the first, I don't know how far back, but 1A Tiuna only goes like a third or a half of the way, maybe a third of the way down the side of the property. So they are currently opposite the existing 3-storey block of flats, which would breach the setback, the res code setback, considerably or fractionally at the moment, the way it is.
At the moment, the existing flats are in breach of the res code setback.
So this is going to be an improvement on them for as far as those flats go. Working back down that property line to where it's the remains of the old house, is that opposite number 1A Tiuna, or is it opposite some other?
So it's opposite the rear of a block of flats facing Ormond Road.
Okay. And the block of flats facing Ormond Road, it's opposite their sort of open area somehow, some of it is. If you divide it up into, roughly speaking, thirds, the first third is opposite 1A Tiuna, and that's the existing 3-storey flats. The next third is opposite an openish sort of parking area or something, and the last third would be against another property in Ormond Road. Does that property have windows out the back?
The plans indicate that there are windows there.
So they would be, they are conceivably considerably worse off in terms of their outlook because of this. But they are, I would say, it seems to me, they're the ones that would have the major impact out of anything on that interface, because they've got open space above the house at the moment.
Through you, Madam Chair. That's correct, but at present they're borrowing their amenity across that rear part of 1 Tiuna Grove. They are not really providing for their own amenity at that interface.
In general, there was a claim that this would be that the gap between the properties was decreased, but I can't. I'm interested to know where that would be so.
Through you, Madam Chair. It's the front portion of the new 3-storey dwelling where it is set back 2 metres from the common boundary. As the building heads to the east, the setback increases to match the setback, well, essentially, of the 3-storey block of flats that are there now.
But is that 2 metre setback more or less than what's there now?
Okay.
There's a ½ metre difference.
Councillor Bond.
I'd like to move that we put the motion. I'd like to put forward an alternative motion.
Councillor Bond's making a put motion. So put motion, we will need to hear Councillor Brand. I'm sorry, that's the proceeding. What is your alternative motion, Councillor Bond?
Thank you. An alternative motion for refusal for 1 to 5 Tiuna Grove, Elwood. The recommendation is refusal. It is recommended that in relation to planning permit application number 772/2018, the responsible authority advise VCAT and other parties to the appeal that Council does not support the amended plans received by Council on 30th of August 2019 for the demolition of the existing buildings at 1 Tiuna Grove and the part demolition of the remaining buildings, including alterations and additions and the construction of a 3-storey building at 1 to 5 Tiuna Grove, Elwood, based on the following grounds. The proposed development would not achieve the outcomes sought by Council's heritage policy at clause 22.04 of the Port Phillip planning scheme. The proposed development represents an overdevelopment of the site and does not achieve the objectives and strategies of Council's land use policy at clause 21.04.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gross to second. Would you like to speak to your motion, Councillor Bond?
Yes, I would. I believe we need to not approve this development on the following grounds.
Can I ask a point of clarification? Are we arguing about whether the motion should be put, or are we arguing about the motion?
No, a put motion is a procedural motion and we're going forward with that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe that we need, as a council, to reject this application as it doesn't meet a number of the guidelines, in my opinion, for the City of Port Phillip with regard to heritage, and this is also an overdevelopment of the site. I don't believe front shells with large developments behind does any due respect to our heritage and our heritage policies. I think the common name for this is facadism, and that is what we would be doing here. I think the separated nature of the houses down in Elwood, where you have house and yard and sides and separated all the way through the streets, I don't think we want these streets to become a series of just facades at the front with these massive built form, all connected down the back, where we have these giant allotments just with minor heritage or minor retention of what is on the site on the front. I mentioned this last time this came to us, and I'm going to mention it again, but the reason we're in this position, or one of the reasons we're in this position, is because of a council decision at the 26th of August 2014, where the previous council to this one sat in these chambers and made a number of changes to our planning scheme where it was a councillor-initiated decision. Basically, it was at the urging of two community groups, the Community Alliance at Port Phillip and Unchained, where they made sure that, or they requested that council, and then they voted on it and approved, that general residential zones in certain parts of Port Phillip were upgraded to residential growth zones in areas like Beacon Cove in Port Melbourne. And for those here today who live in Elwood, Ormond Road, Elwood was amongst those, Beaconsfield, Parade and St Kilda. What they also did was transfer parts of Port Phillip from neighbourhood residential zones to general residential zones, areas like Grey Street, Princess Street, Barclay Street, St Kilda, and for those that live in Elwood, all along Glen Huntley Road and St Kilda Street in Elwood, along with the Ormond Esplanade. What that means is these areas where perhaps we could have a bit of a development were given a lot more height than perhaps they should have, and that extra height now is flowing into our residential streets, and it's part of the reason we are seeing these issues in our residential streets. Areas that should be neighbourhood residential zones with very limited built form are now copping developments such as this because of that decision. If you want to go and read all about it, 26th of August 2014 council meeting, all the information's there on what council did approve in that night, or 6 councillors did approve in that night. I voted against it. So therefore, being consistent, I'll vote against this here tonight. I think we knocked it back last time. I think this is an overdevelopment of a suburban street, and these are the areas of our city that our heritage policy is designed to protect. And I know it's probably going to be a tough ask to get VCAT to agree with us, but I think we certainly need to go in there and argue the point.
Thank you. Councillor Gross.
So we live in a representative democracy, and there are times when representatives in a representative democracy have to represent. We live in we are in a situation where our planning law is a complicated series of judicial rules, but sometimes they have to be read in the context that we are elected officials. And so taking that representative point of view is what drives me. I just want to talk about a couple of things that have been said. Councillor Bonds, I've really got to go back and read that 2014 decision because 26th of August. So, that was, a critical planning issue, and we need to get our heads around the implications of that. And secondly, I think we'd have to take into account that intricate questioning that Councillor Brand was taking us through to look at the actual implications of this application. And thirdly, we have to take into account Councillor Crawford's warning that, and I'm quite troubled by this because I think it's an accurate warning, that if we refuse and if at some future time there is the Minister doesn't approve the interim heritage controls, then that leaves our residents more open and the street to loss of amenity and more open to loss of heritage fabric, and that would grieve me. But these are the risks you take in planning. So I come back to my initial point that drives me, that in a representative democracy sometimes I feel the obligation to represent, and that's what I'm doing tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Brand.
Well, I suppose I have to say where I'm coming from. It will not be succinct, I'm afraid. It is a very complicated issue. I've had an association with the community here in Tiuna Grove, fighting to retain these heritage buildings, which I think was a fantastic community effort. it was a real touch and go decision. We were incredibly fortunate to get the result, and I thought it was a fantastic result. I felt for the developer. I think it is very, very hard on a developer who would buy a block of land which is unimpeded by our planning scheme and then find that it was changed. I think it's a rule which is really, it has unfortunate consequences, but it is fair and necessary, and I was very pleased to be fighting for the saviour of that, to save that heritage. So my feeling at the moment is, when I look at what has transpired since then, that the developer has actually come in with a completely revised set of proposals, which actually do preserve those buildings, not in total, but in significant part, and those gardens, not in total, but in very significant part, that we have what I'm seeing there is a victory. It's a glass half full for me. For others, it's a glass half empty. And I acknowledge that that's a perfectly valid view of the world. But but my belief is that our planning scheme says it's not a matter of achieving the ideal, because we will never achieve the ideal. It is a matter of achieving what is acceptable and what is rule-bound and what is a reasonable way of negotiating all of the different interests that we have. And this isn't just a matter of negotiating interests between a wealthy developer and a whole lot of poor residents. It's a way of dealing with competing ideals of densifying our suburbs, because we need to make our cities denser. We are absolutely destroying bushland, we're destroying good farmland as we spread out, as opposed to retaining the amenity of our suburbs. That's really important too, and we have to negotiate how we do that. Every single building that gets built has an amenity impact, and these are the rules of thumb which we go with, and they've been tried and tested, and then re-tried and tested in VCAT. And I think it's pointless for us to be sending things to VCAT on the hope that they will suddenly support something which even our planning scheme doesn't require. So I go through all of these parts, all of the issues raised with these with this proposal, and I look at all of the issues, and on each one of them I think it falls within the planning scheme, meets the requirements of the planning scheme, meets largely the objectives of the planning scheme. We can go through it issue by issue, which I intend to, which is, if you look at heritage, these buildings have been preserved insofar as our heritage protections preserve buildings all through our suburb, all through the city of Port Phillip. The heritage value of ordinary contributory streetscape type heritage, which these buildings are judged on their appearance from the street, what they do for the streetscape. They do not have internal heritage controls, and they do not have controls that prevent people from building additions, extensions in the back. That would make life in the city of Port Phillip actually impossible. All through the very highest graded heritage areas, important heritage buildings have quite visible additions and extensions at the back. What's happening with this proposal is within all of the heritage rules, all the rules of thumb, and it does exactly what it protects exactly what we protect elsewhere in the city. I don't see this as being a failure. I see it as non-ideal, but I do not see it as a failure of the system. Neighbourhood character. Similarly, we have the garden. This is an amazing thing. We will not see a contemporary development in our city for multi-residential, like 14 different apartments. We will not see this much front garden preserved anywhere. This is unusual. It's actually a victory. For planning density, we're changing it from 8 existing dwellings to, no, we're changing it from 8 existing dwellings to 14 existing dwellings. Is that right? 6 plus 2, yes it is. It's not even doubling the number of people on this, the number of units on these blocks of land as they exist. That's pretty incredible. For the planning parameters, all of the planning parameters, all of the Res Code ones, except for minuscule fractional breaches which are compensated for at other places, with being well within the regulations. They're all preserved. If you took each individual block as an individual development, the development on each block would actually fall within all the parameters of our planning scheme and our heritage protection. We would be able to put buildings all the way along the back fence. 2-storey buildings are quite acceptable along the back fences of our lanes. 3-storey buildings within the Res Code setbacks are accepted throughout our lanes. In an area which has large blocks of flats on the lanes already, we're not going to do better than that. This is maintaining a status quo. This isn't about sort of imposing some sort of alien monster from outer space. In terms of planning precedents, the concern that we would end up with these sort of 2-storey runs of new development along the backyards of house after house after house. This is a unique situation. This was a block of 3 houses, which was, I don't know how they got them together in the first place, but it was because that they were seen as demolishable buildings that the block was consolidatable. It's not going to happen with heritage protected buildings. No developer can afford to buy a whole property to put a little strip of stuff along the back with basement car parking on this sort of basis. It's not going to be something which is going to happen again and again. And on blocks of flats where there'd be a precedent there for increased height anyway, almost all the blocks of flats we have in the city or in Elwood are strata titled, and they're not going to be sold up at the same time too. So it's conceivable because it's happened here that we've got this strange sort of a development, but it is exceedingly unlikely that it'll happen again in this way. It's not setting a precedent that they're going to sort of rush in and do. I'd like to counter Councillor Bond's problem with the zones allowing more height. We are having the same height. We're having a 3- and 2-storey development here. We already have a 3-storey building on the site, and there are lots and lots of houses in the area which are 2 stories. It's not really a terrible, it's not a revolution. This is something which Elwood can accommodate. It seems to be a reasonably good quality, well-designed development. These houses are being preserved and restored, at least in part, for the streetscape which is being preserved. The garden setbacks are being preserved. I'm afraid this is something which I see as a victory, not an entire victory, but a victory for the community, a victory for the city of Port Phillip. And I think, in all fairness to the developer who has managed to do this, it's actually probably a bit of a model of how far you can push people. So I'm afraid I'm going to be voting against my heart, I suppose, but I think that we have, if we go by our planning scheme and uphold our planning scheme, I can't see that we can vote against this.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? If not, I'll just quickly say if this motion fails, I'll put the officer's recommendation forward. And I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? That motion is tied. A tied vote means the chair gets a casting vote. And in this case, I'll vote with the officer's recommendation. So that motion has failed. Thank you. Oh, chamber, please be. The gallery, please be quiet. So that motion has been lost. I'll put
division required.
Councillor Bond has called a division, so I'll ask you to vote again. All those in favour? All those against? Again, that is tied, and the chair has a casting vote, and so I'll vote with the officer's recommendation. So that motion has failed. And just to record the votes on that particular occasion, for Councillor Bond, Councillor Pearl, Councillor Gross and Councillor Crawford, against Councillor Copsey, Councillor Simic, Councillor Brand and Councillor Voss. The casting vote by Councillor Voss against. So we'll put the motion, the officer's motion forward. Do I have a seconder? The gallery, please be quiet. You've had your turn. I'm sorry, the gallery needs to be quiet, please. Any further speakers from the gallery will be removed from the gallery, please. We're in a debate in the chambers, and this is a part of the process. So I have moved the officer's recommendation. Councillor Brand has seconded. I won't speak to the motion. Councillor Brand, do you have a shortened version of speaking to the motion, please? Councillor Simic, do you have a clarifying question?
No, I'm happy to speak to it. Can I speak to it?
Sorry, Councillor Brand, you didn't want to speak again?
Oh, I did, but I can't.
Maybe reserve your right for the moment.
Oh, yes, I will.
Councillor Simic, would you like to speak to the motion?
Very briefly, I think Councillor Brand went through the reasons for supporting the officer's recommendation in quite a lot of detail. It's a very difficult decision, and I can see the sort of concerns that the community have brought to us tonight. I want to start by saying, first of all, that I take issue with many elements of the planning scheme, and I'm deeply disappointed by it constantly. Our role as councillors at this point in the process is to apply the planning scheme and to work with our community and officers to reach outcomes which are consistent with the planning scheme. Councillor Brand is correct. When you go through the pages of the application, there's not sufficient reason to issue a refusal in this instance. There is a very long decision by officers, which includes quite a number of requirements that need to be put in place in order for this to proceed. Our heritage consultant has looked at this application and said supported it, and our officers have looked at this application and provided all of the reasons as to why it's consistent with the planning scheme. It's true that we need to represent our community, but quite often when people come to objections, it's in the part of the process, and the objections are in relation to issues that were actually resolved quite some time ago, and those issues were resolved in the formation of the planning scheme. And it's unfortunate quite often for us as councillors that we have to make decisions which we don't necessarily ourselves agree with, but we take on a semi-judicial role in the role of planning, and we have to take that seriously because it's a legislated responsibility. So they're the reasons that even though on a personal level I don't like this proposal, but on a policy level, the planning scheme means that this is something that needs to be supported tonight. And if we don't, it will end up at VCAT, and I actually think that the community will get a worse outcome, an outcome with far less requirements than what is being recommended tonight. So It is a difficult process, but it's a planning process that was bestowed on us by the state, and here we are. So I hope that explains to some people the decision that they are making tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Pearl.
I have a great deal of sympathy for the developers in this situation. We've been put in a very difficult situation, and I don't apologise for it because it's not really, in some respects, our fault. But it's just the way these things roll out. But it's far from equitable in some respects, depending on which side of the fence you sit on this. And I have a huge degree of sympathy for the situation that you've been put through. You bought property on the basis of a series of regulations, etc., and they have subsequently changed. My view on this proposal is it's basically an overdevelopment of the site. I take on Councillor Brand's very valid points, particularly about the preservation of garden, etc., but it just doesn't meet the amenity of this street, which I've walked down many times to have a look. I understand there's a number of properties which are a lot less fetching in some respects that were built in a different era under a different approval process. In my mind, that doesn't mean that we should make the same mistakes that some of our forebearers have made in the past. For that reason, I won't be supporting the officer's recommendation and was happy to support the previous amended motion to council.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Bond.
I was going to say, I must say, I'd love to sit here and say I was surprised that the CAP and Greens councillors are siding with the developers and forcing this development upon our suburban streets, but I've sat here too many times in this chamber and seen this many times before, including the decision back in August 26, 2014 that has forced lots of inappropriate development on our suburbs. It's a shame it's gone this way. Our planning scheme should be determined by us, not out of fear of what VCAT may or may not do. So very disappointed with this decision, and I certainly won't be supporting this recommendation.
Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Councillor Brand.
I guess I would apologise to the community for disappointing them. They've run an amazing campaign, and they've run two amazing campaigns. One which is incredibly difficult to win, and they won. And this one, which seemed to be, it was a tie, and it hasn't worked out. And I feel extremely bad about that. But I firmly believe that this is a compliance scheme, and it is actually a scheme a proposal that actually amazingly meets the requirements after such a bad start in the first place. So all I can say is I do think this is a glass half empty thing, glass half full, and that our planning scheme requires the glass to be, well, I think it's more than half full actually, and so I think it's a pretty good outcome on the whole. And I won't rise to any other baits about CAP councillors and what have you. The developers' friends, okay. The other councillor who was a member of CAP just voted opposite to me, so there we are. I can't really account for that at all. I am a staunch supporter and campaigner for heritage in this city, for sensible development, for the future, the environmental future of the city. I think that we have to find ways of developing our suburbs in a way that actually allows significant densification and preserves the character and the beauty and the heritage of our suburbs. And I honestly do not think that this in any serious way threatens it. It'll change it slightly. It'll not be to some people's taste. I think this isn't a bad outcome. So I'm supporting it.
Any further speakers? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? All those against?
Division required.
That motion is tied. And once again, the Chair has a casting vote, and I will vote with the officer's recommendation, so that motion has won. Councillor Bond has requested a division, so I'll ask you to vote again. All those in favour? Councillor Copsey, Councillor Simic, Councillor Brand, my apologies, Councillor Voss. All those against? Councillor Bond, Councillor Pearl, Councillor Gross and Councillor Crawford. That motion is a tie, and Councillor Voss is voting for the officer's recommendation, so that motion has passed. Thank you very much for your time this evening. We'll now move on to 101 Salmon Street, Port Melbourne. I understand there has been a request from the applicant to defer this item. Mr Borg, are you able to speak to that, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, a request has been put to us from the... Yes, absolutely. Through you, Madam Chair, a request has been put to us by the applicant's representative, Alicia Riley, who's indicated that either the application be removed from the agenda this evening, as it's still running. The other option that has been put is the request for a deferral of the decision of the application until such time as the applicant has been able to address the provision of the additional information with a full set of revised plans and the substitution of a full set of revised plans responding to the concerns of Council in Elwood.
Thanks, Mr Borg. Do we actually have any wording around this, or do we?
We do, Madam Chair. Provide that to you.
Pretty simple. 3.1, that this item be deferred. Is that all that's needed?
That is correct, Madam Chair.
I'll move that. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Brand to second. I don't think anyone needs to speak to that, so we'll just put that motion. All those in favour that that motion be deferred? Thank you. That's passed unanimously. Thanks, Alicia, for waiting so long. Move to item 36, Kitchen Road, Port Melbourne. Councillors, we don't have anyone that's requested to speak to this item. Do you have any questions of the officers? If not, we have... Councillor Brand, do you have a question?
Why are we dealing with this tonight here in the chamber?
Through you, Madam Chair, we're dealing with this because this is an application which involves a residential building. Under our delegation, all applications in Fisherman's Bend which have a residential component must be presented to a council meeting.
Any further questions? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Councillor Copsey to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Baxter, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Copsey? Councillor Baxter, would anyone else like to speak to the motion? If not, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Then we'll move to our last item on the agenda, which is 7.7, the Statutory Planning Delegated Decisions Report for September 2019. We have an officer's recommendation. Before that's put, does anyone have any questions? Then do I have a mover? Councillor Baxter to move, Councillor Simic to second. Councillor Baxter, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Simic, would you like to speak to the motion? Would anyone else like to speak? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Item 8 is urgent business, and councillors, are there any items of urgent business? There are none. Item 9, confidential matters, and we have no confidential matters tonight. So there being no further business, I declare the meeting closed. Thank you. Good night.